Greetings, folk. Hope you and family are doing well. In a recent government funded training on digitalization, it was rather ironic to see the volume of paper based training assessment material folks had to go through to get their grades. Needless to say, the assessors themselves had volumes of paperwork to do as well to certify folk. Well, with Microsoft Forms, Power Automate, and Power BI hosted on Microsoft Teams, one can make this process really simple and go digital without killing any trees. Needless to say, you still have to do the assessment. Kindly see the link to a detailed video on YouTube on how to do so. Very, very simple. Thank you very much. So, greetings, folks. So, what we're going to do now is to do an end-to-end walkthrough of how to make the solution happen, right? So, the first step basically is to start at the form, which is your input. So, what you do is you go up to your office.com, like literally go type office.com and hit enter, and it will ask you to log in using your Microsoft Office 365 credentials. So kindly do so with your login and password. If you've got MFA set up, it's going to show up on your phone or you're going to get a call. So once you're logged in here, if you click on the 9 dots here or the waffle, you will actually see a few things. You will see Forms here, you will see Power Automate here, and you will see SharePoint. We need all three, right? So Forms is the input, SharePoint is where the data is going to get stored, and then Power Automate is that process engine that's going to take the data from Forms and store it to SharePoint. Further, what you would need is Power BI to visualize the data that is in SharePoint. So we're going to cover off all of this. So the starting point basically is Forms. So if I were to click on Forms here, this goes away and brings up Forms. And if you've got, Office 365, F3 as a frontline worker, or E3, or even E1, you should be able to have access to this one, okay? So if you basically here say, let's start a new quiz, and then you give it a name and then say my first assessment quiz, for the lack of a better reason, and that would be the title. And then I'm going to actually click on choice. That actually gives me the ability to ask a question with a few choices, right? So I'm going to say Microsoft is coming out with a new version of Power Apps that shows up at 2 p.m. every day, called Power Naps. Power Naps. I know you folks work really hard, a little bit of humor here, okay? And then the options here are going to be true and false, right? True and false. And you click the true obviously as the answer, right? No. So we're going to say false, okay? We're going to say false. It was a joke. And that's it. And then you can make this required, so on and so forth. So you fill out, when you're doing assessment, you'd probably do anywhere between 10 to 20 questions, MCQ. And most of these are going to be choice questions, right? And then because you're actually logged in here, Microsoft actually knows that it's you who's logged in. So the responder's email is automatic. So you don't need to ask someone what their name is, so on and so forth. That information you can actually get from the login itself, right? So once you complete this form, you go and basically say collect responses, and depending on whether you're doing this internally within your organization or externally, you can go in and say anyone can respond, which becomes anonymous. In that case, you would need to ask for the email ID, so you know who's actually responding and the first name and last name. But if it's within your organization, you don't have to, right? And once you're done with this, you merely just enter in the name of the people. As an example, Adele here, or so on and so forth. There are a few accounts within this demo tenant that I could add, and then send this form over to people to fill out. Okay? So, or you could actually copy this and then go over to Teams and then post it in your team so that folks can actually use the quiz. Or you could even send them a QR code and folks can scan the QR code over the phone and then do the assessment. Very, very effective, very, very simple to do. Okay, so once you have this, now how do you get this data into a data store? Because here you could actually get the responses out in Excel, but that's not elegant, having so many different Excels across so many different classes isn't exactly the most efficient. So you want this in your SharePoint. So what you do is you would go to your Power Automate, right? So if I were to go back to my Office 365, click on the 9 dots here, you will see Power Automate. If you've got, the frontline worker SKU MF3, or if you've got E3, Microsoft 365 E3 at a bare minimum, you will actually have Power Apps, Power Automate, and among other things, okay? So what you need is Power Automate, which is an automation tool. So you go in and then you basically click on create. That gives you the ability to create different flows. You could either do an automated flow where the trigger is automatic. When you submit make a request, or when you submit a form, the flow runs and saves the data to SharePoint. Or an instant flow is where you click a button and you get the data. In our case, we need an automated flow. So I'm going to actually click on this and then say my assessment flow, right? And then I'm here as a trigger, I say when a new response is submitted in Microsoft Forms. So I'm going to click on this guy and create this, right? So upon starting the flow, it basically kicks off this template, if you will, or an editor or a studio or a canvas, whichever way you look at it. So if I do this drop down here, I'm going to close this guy. Thank you for all the help. If I click here, this goes away and then it brings up all our forms, right? Power Platform Assessment, blah, 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 right? And then I think our form is called My First Assessment. So it should be here, My First Assessment Quiz. There it is, you see, My First Assessment Quiz, right? Is that what we called it? Something like that, right? Yes, My First Assessment Quiz is what we called it. And here is the question. So I'm going to go back here and select My First Assessment Quiz. And then the new step I'm going to add is, when somebody submits a response to this quiz, I want to capture it in SharePoint. So I'm going to basically say, get response details from this form. So when I say get response details, there is an action that shows up off of this trigger that asks me for the form ID. So I know I've got my first assessment quiz here. I have the response ID, which is the ID of the line item of the first fill out of the form. Has an ID. That's a line item, isn't it? When I fill out the form and hit submit, that is basically a line item for me, right? My responses are recorded, and they are recorded basically as a unique ID. So I click on this ID here. Whoops. So I click on this ID and that, records my response, right? So now what I'm going to do is I need to store this somewhere, isn't it? Right? So I'm going to put these two together so we don't have to keep going back and forth. So I know my question, I know my answer, isn't it? Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually say I just want a column within SharePoint to capture the answer. So I'm going to go to my office.com, open up my SharePoint. So in my SharePoint, it opens up. And I'm basically going to actually pick one. I'm just going to say training, right? I'm going to pick this as a site, right? SharePoint site. So SharePoint's basically got this address, much like an address to a condo. Then it's got a container called sites. And in the container, I've got one called training, right? So here I'm going to add a table, right? A list is basically a table. I'm going to say blank list, and I'm going to call this training, I need AI, training assessment. And then I'm going to click on create, right? So this goes away and actually creates a table within SharePoint, right? It comes with a default column called train. So what I'm going to do is the response to the first question, I'm going to capture it here. Okay. So I'm going to grab hold of the training site like so, Control C. So sites and training, I'm going to grab hold of this, go over to my Power Automate, and in a new step, I'm going to say create item, right? Create item. And then this goes away and gives me the option to create an item in SharePoint. So obviously it's going to ask me for my site. And when I look at this, I can see over here that there is the training site. And then the list name is the one that we just created, which is training assessment. Now, lo and behold, as I put down the list name, if I go to advanced options, it is asking me for, hey, what do you want to capture in the title? So if I click on this, you will actually see Microsoft is coming out with a new version of Power Apps. You see this? It is automatically actually giving me an option to capture the answer to this question. You see the answer to this question. So I'm going to click here. Oops, I'm going to click here. So that actually captures, the what do you call the answer to the question. Over and beyond this, I can have other columns that will capture the responder's email ID and then the submission time, because the assessment is done after 3 days or 2 days or whatever, so you can actually get the exact time and so on and so forth, answers to other questions, blah, 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 right? You get the point. So I'm going to actually save this flow. So now let us actually go ahead and preview this form, right? Assume that I'm actually filling this out. So I'm going to go preview, and Microsoft is coming out a new version of Power Apps. So clearly this is false. So I'm going to click on false, and I'm going to actually submit this response. So now this response is actually submitted. If I go to the flow right now and go over to the management layer of the flow, which gives me information about, the name of the flow, who is the owner, when was it created, what's the status, so on and so forth. And down below here, it shows me the 28-day run history. And as you can see, basically the flow has succeeded. So if I click on this guy right now, it shows me the steps that it's actually gone through to capture information. So when a new response is submitted, okay, that was good. Get response details. So it's actually like, captured, the answer to this question. It's got the responder's email. It's got the submission time, both of which could be recorded. I'm not doing it, but I'll show you a case where I've done this. And I can actually see that in SharePoint, the title column captures the answer, right? Which is basically false. So if I go over to my SharePoint right now, you will actually see that the answer to the first question has been captured as false. If I have multiple questions like so, I can capture all those as well, right? So I've done you saw the LinkedIn video. So let us actually unpack that a little bit. If I were to go to my form here, the digital transformation assessment responses, it's got one, value chain mapping obviously is a very important aspect of, a critical element of business strategy. Identifying, key processes by your value chain is a second step. Once you know the processes, you map the data elements out, and you could use Microsoft Power Platform, be it Power Apps, Power BI, Power Automate, to enable digitalization. And then basically digital assessment is a pain-free way of actually doing, testing learnings, but the real assessment is out in the field. Once you make the processes go digital is the real assessment, right? So you've got all these. Now, if I were to go over to my Power BI here, I'm just going to kindly give me just a second. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but I want to see my sources. So I'm just going to go over here, and I'm going to look at this is assessment. So it is a site called assessment. Okay, so I'm going to go back up here, and I'm going to go to SharePoint. I'm going to go click on home, and I'm going to go to a site called assessment transactions. This assessment transactions is where I have actually captured the output of this form across many different users. You follow me? So as users come in and then they do the assessment here and submit their responses, I've collected the responses over here. As an example, we have got all these people. Alan, Adele, Lynn, Lee, so on and so forth, who have gone and answered these questions as true or false, so on and so forth. There are 5 questions here. I typically do about 15 to 20 questions towards the end of the course. Okay. Now, historically, this has been done on paper, so you can just imagine the pain there is for people, especially if you're on funded government courses. You will have to have a written exam and then a practical exam. And here, the written exam basically, it's on paper based, and it's a really, really painful process for people to do this. Now you're so elegantly capturing the output digitally, right? So once you have this and once you know the site, what you could do is you go open up your Power BI. Now here it's a completed Power BI, but regardless, when you open your blank Power BI, the first thing you do is to go over to what is called as transform data, right? This is actually, we've been saying man's best friend for the past thousands of years. It's time for us to say women's best friend. This truly is women's best friend, okay? So I go to click on transform data. What it does is it opens up our famous Power Query editor, okay? So in the Power Query editor, if I go to new source over here, and if I say blank query, I'm not going to say blank query. I'm going to actually just delete this for a second. That was got ahead of myself a little bit. So if I were to go to new source, and then if I click on more here, that gives me the ability to access the SharePoint table that we just created and got information from the form, okay? So it takes a minute or so, and then if I go to the online services here, there is a SharePoint list, right? So now I'm going to connect to this list, and once I connect to this list, this goes away and basically asks me, hey, what is the site URL? So I can actually put down my site URL, which is it says training site, but I need the other site, right? So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to actually grab hold of this site, the assessment site, right? So I'm going to grab hold of this assessment site here, Control V, and then click OK. And this goes away and basically asks me for authentication. In my case, since I've actually done it before, this is going to, it's just going to pull everything. But in your case, you will have to use your Office 365 ID and password to authenticate. And here are all the tables that I have. And then I've got my assessment transactions here, right? So once I click on this, it gives me a preview of this. You click OK, and then you bring the data over to your Power Query. So like so, right? So once I get it over to Power Query, I do a number of things, right? When the data actually comes into Power Query, it's got a lot of information from SharePoint. In addition to the data that we collected on the questions, see, you've got the questions, right? You've got, I should probably go over here to see the raw output. So this is the raw output that, comes in from SharePoint, right? So it's got all this metadata, information about your data, file system object type. It's got content type ID, when was it modified, when was it created, so on and so forth. And then it's got the answers to your questions, Q1, Q2, Q3, so on. These are the 5 questions I asked, and it's got answers to your questions. Now, I don't need all of the rest of the information. So what I could do is I literally could go to choose columns and then basically go to columns and then say, hey, you know what, take away, or I could choose columns here. Sorry, if I go to choose columns, and then I could choose which columns I want, right? I'm not going to, add a step here, but I'm just showing you that you could choose those columns and then just unclick them and remove those columns, right? So when I do this, when I click on this remove column step here, it basically only shows me the columns that I really want. The rest of them have actually been removed, right? Then what I do is I go ahead, I basically, change type, make the answers are text over here, so on and so forth, right? And then I rename those columns to make it more amenable for end users to understand what these things are. And then I'm going to do an operation that unpivots the columns, right? So all the questions I want in one column, I want the answers, all the actual value, true or false, in one column, right? So these are horizontal over here, right? These are horizontal. When I unpivot them, right? When I select those columns and unpivot them, it puts them in one column. How do I do that? I just select, these questions that I want in one column, and then I basically right mouse on this, and then I say unpivot only selected columns. So this actually goes ahead and unpivots it. So now you have your columns of your questions and the corresponding answers, right? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a conditional column here that basically says, hey, look, if the answer is true, give it 5 points. If it's false, give it 0 points. Okay, so this actually gives me the score, the actual numeric score. And since I have 5 questions, it is 5 points per right answer. So the max is 25 points. And then this basically versus those 25 points by person, it gives me this the scoring, right? So then I basically also add another column over here. I add another column that basically gives me the max score as one line item, right? In this conditional column, I've basically said, hey, look, and if I edit this, it basically says, if your question is, if your value is equal to true, make it 5. If the value is equal to false, make it 0. So that's how I arrive at the score column. And then if I go to the max score column, basically that's the one. I'm going to cancel this. I don't want to add any additional column. It's already here. So if I go to the max score column over here, this tells me vis-a-vis the answer, the maximum possible points is 5. Okay. So once I have this, what I'm going to do is I want to sum up the score here. I want to sum up the score and the max score by the email ID of the person. So for this admin person, I want to sum up all the scores, of how they answered and then versus the max score. So I'm going to add another table over here, right? And the basic source of this table is essentially your assessment transactions. You actually start here in your assessment transactions. So I've literally gone ahead, right mouse this, and then I've said reference, right? So when I say reference, it goes ahead and creates another query here. I assume that you're fairly familiar with Power BI. Anyway, so it goes ahead and adds another query here that is a replica of this query. So any changes made on this query will automatically be taken in by the second query. And here what I do is I group the rows, right? I group the rows and I group it by, if I right mouse on this and edit the setting. So what I've done here is I have grouped the rows by title, which is where the email IDs of the person is, and then by value, which is the answer, right? So group it by the title and value, and then give me 2 columns which sums up the score and which sums up the max score, right? So for each person, I want to know how much is their total for the 5 questions, and I want to know the maximum possible per person, which is 25, because there are only 5 questions and it is 5 points per question, right? So I do that. Then what I do is once I do this grouped rows, then I'm further going to add this up by just the email ID. I don't want this value here, so I'm going to group this further. And if I right mouse on this, if I edit this, what I'm doing basically is I'm going to group it just by the email ID, and I want to sum of the scores in the previous step, right? Now that had summed it up by both the title as well as the answer, which is true or false. So in this step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sum up the total scores that people have only by the email ID. So what that does is that it'll give me by the person what is the total score versus what is the max score. So I can actually calculate the pass rate, right? The idea here is if anyone actually scores greater than 20, they pass, right? So 20 is literally the failing grade. So if you don't score 20, you fail, right? So now I can very easily calculate what the passing rate is, right? So then I add a column over here, I calculate the percent score, then I change the type of this. Over here, you see I go in and actually say this is a percent, so I made it into a percent. I added a column over here called, the passing percent, and then change the type over here to say, what should be the official, pass percent and what is the score and so on and so forth, okay? So I have my raw data over here in terms of the score, the max score by, question. And then here I have the summed up scores by person. So I've got both now, right? Then what I do is when I click on this assessment transactions, if I right mouse on it, I can add this as a new query, okay? So this goes away and adds a new query, and here I can literally do this in front of you. I'm gonna click on this, I'm gonna say add as a new query. So this goes ahead and adds a new query here, and it adds it as a list of all the email IDs, okay? So then further what I could do is I could basically just go in here and then say, hey, remove all the duplicates. So it goes away and removes all the duplicates, and then I have a distinct list of email IDs, which is going to be a primary key for me. Okay, if you know data modeling, you have a master table in which you have primary keys, you have a transaction tables in which you have foreign keys. So this way, I've attached this to my assessment transaction. So if there are more email IDs added, more people take the survey and more email IDs get added, it automatically gives you, updates you your master table. Okay, so I'm going to delete this guy because I don't actually need this right now. So I already have this, right? So I've got my master table of all the names, all the email IDs. And then I go ahead here and I add basically a conditional column, right? And I basically say, if I edit this, I add all the email IDs of people who have taken the class, and then said, if the email ID is equal to admin, the first name is Sanjeev, or the full name is Sanjeev Venkatram. If it is Lydia Holloway, so on and so forth, Lee Gu, and then so on and so forth, right? So I add all the email IDs in class who are going to be taking the assessment, and then basically say, okay, their names, is going to be listed out here as well, right? That's all I need to do. Once I'm done with this master table, I'm going to enter data here. What this does is that basically, if I say enter data, it allows me to add a blank query here, okay? So I'm going to call this one master measures. And the reason why I add this is I just want to get all the formulae here, right? I don't want the formulae, we'll see this in Power BI shortly. I don't want the formulae to be sitting in individual queries. I want it to sit in a table that is unencumbered, that's got no data, okay? So that's why I create this table which is blank, and then I'm going to say close and apply. What this does is that it basically closes this Power Query editor and brings everything over to my Power BI, like so, right? If I go to my Power BI, it's taking me a second, right? So then it brings all the data over to Power BI, and you will be able to see that it has brought in the assessment transaction. It has brought in this assessment transaction summary, the one that we actually summed up, right? So it's got that and the master table. Now I can create a data model. So I've got my transaction tables, I've got my master table, and I can do a drag and drop from email to the title, which is also email. So it's a one-to-many relationship. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here, email to title. So that's also a one-to-many relationship. So now I have a relationship going here. I don't need a bidirectional relationship here. It's just added one. I can make it a single direction going from the master table to the transaction table. Okay. Once I have this, then I go ahead and I actually create what are called as measures, right? So if I go open up my master measures table here, so this is where I add my aggregations and I actually do my formula. As an example, my score is the summary, is the sum of all the scores in the assessment transaction table. So if I go to my assessment transaction table here, the scores are here, I'm just summing it up, right? Summing up the max score, summing up the score. So I get my score. And then if I go to my percent score, basically what I'm doing is I'm just summing up, in the assessment sum, right? So here, what I'm doing is I'm just summing up the score. Whereas in the assessment, in the percent score, what I'm doing is I'm summing up the percent score in the assessment sum transaction table. If I go to the assessment sum transaction table over here, which is what we summarized, I'm summing up this score here, okay? I'm just summing up the total score. So then I get my percent score over here, right? Then I basically have other ones, which is basically the number of students, right? Distinct count of the full names gives me the number of students. And then it can go to pass rate, which is basically the students who actually score over 80% are the ones who pass. So what I've done here is I've basically said calculate, okay, the distinct count of the email IDs of people, the distinct count of email IDs of people under the condition or by filtering the sum assessment transaction table and then setting the total score to be greater than 20. If the total score is greater than 20 in the assessment sums transaction table, then go ahead and calculate the number of students or the count of students who meet this criteria, is what this formula is actually saying, right? And by the way, this formula is written as in what is called as DAX, Data Analysis Exchange Formula, okay? If you're, good with Power BI, all of this should be very familiar to you, should be fairly straightforward, okay? So once you got this, then you can calculate the pass rate to basically say, hey, look, if give me the value or the total value of, say, the students who have scored over like 80%, and you basically divide that by the number of students, and that will give you your essential pass rate, right? So how many people have actually scored over 80, and then you divide it by the number of students and you'll actually get the pass rate, okay? So then you can go ahead and make your visualizations over here. As an example, I don't think I need to actually get into this because this itself is a little bit of a body of work as to how to do this visualization, which I assume you folks actually know. If you don't, kindly do let me know. I can probably do a session to you guys as to how to do this. But anyway, so once you get it, you can actually add some bookmarks and you can say, hey, look, here is the student score, here are the student performance details. So you can actually list the people, you have the questions on top, and you can actually say, what are the scores by these people. Then you can actually say, hey, how many people basically didn't pass, and then Grady unfortunately didn't make the cut. So if I click on Grady here, it basically tells me these two questions, mapping data elements and digital assessment, are the ones that he basically got us wrong. So likewise, you can actually go ahead and do something like this. Completely up to you as to how you want to display the data. And the beautiful feature of Power BI is you got Q&A as well, right? So here what I'm saying is student non-compliant, give me the names, and it's basically listing out Grady and Holloway. If I basically just say give me the names of all the students, student name, and then it's going to give me everyone's name over here. And then I say student NC non-compliant, and then if I basically say non-compliant, it says 2. And then if I say give me their names, and it gives me the names. It's absolutely fantastic, this Q&A thing, right? So once you have this, this is your end result. You publish this to Power BI, and then it goes away, and then it is published on Power BI. And what you could do finally is, if I were to go open up my Teams here, Microsoft Teams, you could actually embed the Power BI within your Teams, right? So if I click on this Power BI, if I say publish, this goes away and then says, okay, you want to save the data, fine. And then it basically brings up this little window that allows us to take this BI and the data and publish it to the cloud. It takes a couple of minutes for this to happen. It's saving the data first, locally, and then it's actually going to go, publish this. Okay. So there it is. It's now it's asking me to publish it to my workspace. Now you can have different workspaces where you publish it. Your own workspace is perfect. So you select this. I'm not going to replace it. So once it's actually published over there, and if I were to go to powerbi.com, and if I were to go ahead and go to my workspace here, there is a fair bit of depth to this. Each of these workspaces basically is what is called as a security group in Microsoft 365. As an example, there is market, project team. And then if I go to my admin center over here, you will actually see, just to digress a little bit, I do apologize, but I wanted to show what that workspace really is that if I go to teams and groups over here, and then go to active teams and groups, basically you will see that Mark 8's team is a Microsoft 365 group over here. There are so many of them here, but then if I go down, MARK. See, Mark 8 project team is actually a security group that has been promoted to a team, right? So if I go to my Power BI here, it shows up as Mark 8 project team. If I go to my teams over here, and in the hidden teams, you will also see Mark 8 project team. So the chassis underneath it is basically Office 365 group. Okay. Anyway, so in my workspace, if I go to my workspace right now, I will find two things. I will find basically the data, the digital transformation assessment data that was in this Power BI that's been stored on my PC has now been stored online. And then the report itself is also online. Okay. So when I go to my teams here, and if I were to go to, let us say, Mark's team for some reason, I just and if I go to the general channel here, if I click on this guy, plus here, and then I go to the different applications that I can actually host here. If I click on Power BI, then it's going to ask me, hey, which Power BI do you want to host on this team, right? So this is going away, it's doing its thing. And then if I open up this workspace, there is my assessment, save this guy, and lo and behold, there is my Power BI, right? There's my Power BI. So let's understand the scenario over here, right? So in a class, when you do these Power Platform classes, whether it's Power Apps or Power BI, or you're doing Teams classes or whatever, you're basically going to actually, or digital transformation classes, as a matter of fact, basically you're going to have a set of dummy accounts, right? Like how I have over here. So you would give those dummy accounts to people, and then you put them on teams like so, right? So the advantage of doing so is you can share some materials with them, especially if they're government customers and they don't have, internet directly on their PCs. There are some restrictions that, the government imposes on folks. So this is one way where you could externally and internally communicate with each other. You give them a set of demo accounts, put them on Teams, and then right here you can actually even during the course communicate with them. And then once the course is done and the assessment is done, basically the Power BI here will tell you, hey, how many of them have actually cleared the course, who are the ones who don't who are not. And then if you want to do any kind of recovery with those folks, exactly, if I go to these, not competent, let us say, that's what, people here in this part of the world say. So if I click on this Grady's, answers, we know that these two are false, and then you can actually do some recovery to say, hey, look, why do you think the data elements are not important? These are blah, blah, blah. And then, you work with the person, give them another quick couple questions, and then pass them, right? So you can do all of this literally, right off the bat. You can actually do this because your Power BI enables you to do this real time. Okay, and then you can literally host it and everybody can see this. There are no secrets. Okay, I trust this was actually helpful. This is literally how simple it is to actually do assessments and get your data. I mean, you saw it literally me doing this within half an hour to 45 minutes. And this is a one-time setup. And the assessment date is up here. So you can actually start collecting data across many different courses, and you can do some trending to see how people are performing, different batches of your folks are performing. And then is there an increasing trend in this, and so on and so forth. Finally, I just want to leave you with this thought that you may actually do course assessments like so. The real assessment is out in the field. When people actually start applying all of this, let's say they've got 10 processes and they're building those low-code applications, each process is one app. When they start building those applications and then digitalizing them, that's the real assessment, right? This one is to satisfy somebody to get their funding and so on. I mean, so the amount of value that I would actually attribute to this, is questionable. But you have to do it. It's just compliance to, processes that the government has in this part of the world, right? But in your case, it may not be the case. You can plan things out separately. If you need help, kindly do reach out. If I were to go to my LinkedIn profile here, my name is, it's funny that I'm giving you my name towards the end, but my name is Sanjeev Venkatram. Let me actually go up here and go to profile, right? So my name is Sanjeev Venkatram. I have my own little firm called Prudential Consulting, and our goal basically is to help end users be happy, right? I've been an end user for almost 30 years. So this is my way of actually giving back to society. Okay, so kindly do connect with me. Sanjeev Venkatram is my name. Okay, thank you very much, folks. I trust this was helpful. Thank you very much.